The carriage wheel cracked against a stone in the dark, and Alara Whitmore was thrown hard against the door, her breath catching as the whole frame groaned under the strain. Rain hammered the roof like a drumline of warning. Somewhere ahead, thunder rolled over the hills of Cane Land, and the driver shouted something she could not hear over the storm. She gripped the seat and told herself this was simply a rough road, nothing more, though her heart refused to believe it. She had left her father's house that morning, with a single trunk and a signed marriage contract folded inside her glove, the ink barely dry. The match had been arranged in a week, sealed in an afternoon, and now she was riding through a storm toward a husband she had met exactly once, for the length of a single dinner where he had barely lifted his eyes from his plate. Duke Alaric Kane. She repeated the name in her mind, like a charm meant to calm her, though it did nothing of the sort. The carriage lurched again, and this time it did not recover. A wheel had split. The driver climbed down into the rain, cursing under his breath, and told her they would need to walk the last stretch to the manor gates. Alara pulled her cloak tight and stepped out into the storm, mud swallowing her boots to the ankle, and looked up at the shape of Cane Manor, rising against the black sky, like a mountain built of gray stone and cold windows. Not a single one of those windows was lit for her. She had expected torches. She had expected servants with umbrellas and a warm hall, and perhaps, if she was fortunate, a husband waiting to greet his new wife with at least the courtesy a stranger deserved. Instead, she walked alone through the iron gates, rain streaming down her collar, until an elderly butler finally opened the great door, took one look at her soaked and shivering figure, and said only, "You must be the bride." The words held no warmth. They held something closer to pity. Inside, the hall was vast and cold, lit by only a few candles, as if the house itself had not been told to expect a mistress. Alara stood dripping on the marble floor, while the butler, whose name she would later learn was Dunbar, sent for towels and a fire to be lit in the smaller drawing room. She asked, as calmly as she could manage, where the Duke was. Dunbar's face changed in a way she would remember for a long time. It was not cruelty, it was something worse. A kind of resigned sorrow, the look of a man delivering news he had delivered too many times before. "His Grace departed for the continent 3 days ago," Dunbar said. "A diplomatic matter, we were told. He did not know precisely when he would return." Alara stood very still. The rainwater dripped from the hem of her cloak onto the floor, forming a small, dark pool. She had traveled 2 days through storms and mud to marry a man who had left before she even arrived. There had been no note. No apology, not even the courtesy of a lie crafted well enough to soften the blow. She did not cry. She had promised herself in the carriage, somewhere between the second lightning strike and the third, that she would not give this house the satisfaction of her tears, whatever waited for her inside it. Instead, she asked Dunbar to show her to a room where she might dry her clothes, and she thanked him for his honesty, because it seemed the only thing in the house that had been offered to her honestly at all. The room she was given was small, tucked at the end of a corridor far from the family wing, the kind of room reserved for a guest of no particular importance. She understood the message clearly enough. She was not to be treated as a duchess. She was to be tolerated as an inconvenience, filed away until her husband returned to decide what to do with her. That night, alone in a cold bed in an unfamiliar house, Alara allowed herself exactly 1 hour of grief. She thought of her father, whose estates had crumbled under bad harvests and worse debts, and who had looked almost relieved when the Kane family offered the match, as though marrying his daughter away solved a problem he could no longer bear to look at. She thought of her mother, long gone, and wondered what she would have said to see her daughter standing soaked in a stranger's hall, while her husband sailed toward some foreign shore without a backward glance. Then she wiped her face, folded her grief away like a garment she would not wear again, and slept. Morning came gray and quiet. The storm passed, leaving the grounds glistening and washed clean. Alara rose before the house had fully woken, dressed in the only gown that had survived the previous night's rain undamaged, and walked the corridors of Cane Manor with her chin lifted, as though she had every right to be there. Because, she reminded herself, she did. The contract bore her name beside his. Whatever Alaric Kane thought of the arrangement, she was his wife, and she intended to be treated as one, even if she had to earn that treatment herself. She found the Dowager Duchess, Alaric's mother, taking tea in a bright morning room that overlooked a garden gone slightly wild with neglect. Lady Margaret Kane was a tall woman, with silver hair pinned severely back and eyes that assessed Alara from the doorway, with the swift, cold efficiency of a woman used to sizing up threats to her family's position. "So you are the girl," Margaret said, not rising. "I had wondered when you would appear." "I arrived last night," Alara said, "in the storm." "Yes, Dunbar mentioned it." Margaret's tone suggested this fact interested her very little. "My son will return when his business concludes. Until then, I imagine you will find some way to occupy yourself." There was no invitation to sit, no offer of tea. Alara understood, in that single exchange, precisely how she was viewed within these walls. A placeholder, a name on a contract, an obligation to be endured rather than a person to be welcomed. She could have withdrawn. She could have retreated to her small room and waited, as perhaps the dowager expected her to, for her husband's return to determine her fate. Instead, she asked a single question that would change the shape of everything that followed. "Who manages the estate ledgers while his grace is away?" Margaret's eyebrows rose fractionally, the first genuine reaction Alara had drawn from her. "Mr. Foley, the steward, handles such matters. Why would that concern you?" "Because I intend to understand my new home," Alara said simply. "All of it." She left the morning room before Margaret could object, and made her way toward the estate offices, a modest set of rooms near the kitchens where the business of the household was conducted. She found Mr. Foley bent over a ledger, a heavy-set man with ink-stained fingers and a manner that shifted, the moment he recognized her, from irritation to a kind of oily politeness that made her skin prickle with instinct. "Lady Kane," he said, using her married name before she had claimed it herself, as though testing how it fit. "I did not expect a visit from you." "I would like to review the household accounts," Alara said, "all of them, beginning with the last 12 months. Foley's smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes did. "Estate matters are rather complex, my lady. I would not wish to burden you with figures better left to those trained in such things. I was raised managing my father's estate books from the age of 12, Alara said, her voice even. "I assure you, I am not easily burdened by figures." It was, in part, a lie, meant to test him, though it carried a grain of truth beneath it. She had indeed helped her father with his accounts, watching him sink slowly into debt despite every effort, learning in the process exactly what mismanagement looked like on a page. Foley hesitated, clearly searching for a polite way to refuse her, but with the dowager offering no support and no clear order forbidding it, he had no true grounds to deny a request from the lady of the house. He brought her the ledgers with obvious reluctance, and Alara spent the remainder of that first full day at Kane Manor, bent over columns of numbers by candlelight, tracing the movement of grain, coin, and rent through the estate's veins. What she found unsettled her more with every page she turned. Payments to merchants who did not appear to exist. Rents collected from tenant farms that were recorded as vacant. Repairs billed twice, in different months, for the same stretch of roof. It was not the work of a careless man. It was the work of a careful one, skilled enough to hide his theft in the gaps between entries, confident that no one would ever look closely enough to notice. Alara said nothing that first night. She simply copied the discrepancies into a private notebook of her own, in a code only she would understand, and returned the ledgers to Foley's office before he returned to look for them. She understood, with a clarity that steadied her nerves, that she had stumbled onto something far larger than a marriage gone cold. She had found a thread that, pulled carefully, might unravel a fraud that had bled Kane land dry for years. And unlike her husband, who had abandoned this house and everyone in it without a second thought, Alara did not intend to run from what she found. Over the following days, she moved through Kane Manor like a quiet current beneath still water, watching everything, saying little. She learned the names of the servants. A kitchen maid named Nora, with clever eyes and a sharp tongue she kept carefully hidden from her superiors. A groundskeeper named Emrys, who had served the family since before Alaric was born. A young footman named Colin, who watched Foley with a wariness that told Alara more than words could have. She began, carefully, to earn their trust. She thanked Nora by name, when she brought the morning tray, rather than ignoring her as the other members of the family did. She asked Emrys about the garden's neglect and listened, truly listened, as he explained that funds meant for the grounds had been quietly diverted elsewhere for over a year. She noticed Colin's discomfort around the steward and, one quiet evening, asked him directly whether he had ever seen anything in the estate offices that troubled him. Colin hesitated for a long moment, glancing toward the door, as though Foley might appear from the shadows to punish him for speaking. Then, in a low voice, he told her about ledgers that were rewritten late at night, about a locked drawer in Foley's desk that no servant was permitted to touch, about coin that arrived from tenant rents and somehow never seemed to reach the family's accounts in full. It was not proof, not yet. But it was a thread, and Alara had learned, in the space of a single week, that threads pulled patiently enough eventually unraveled entire tapestries of deception. She wrote nothing of this to her husband, wherever he was on the continent, indulging whatever business he had deemed more urgent than his own marriage. She felt no obligation to inform a man who had not bothered to inform her of his own departure. Instead, she turned her attention fully toward the household itself, determined that if she was to be abandoned in this cold stone house, she would at least understand every corner of it before anyone returned to reclaim it from her. The Dowager Duchess watched these developments with a wariness she did not bother to hide. Margaret Kane had expected a meek girl who would keep to her room, embarrassed by her husband's absence, grateful for whatever scraps of attention the family chose to offer. Instead, she found a young woman rising before dawn, walking the grounds with the groundskeeper, asking pointed questions of the steward, and speaking to servants as though their opinions carried weight. "You are drawing attention to yourself," Margaret said one evening, finding Alara in the estate office long after the household had gone to bed, a lamp burning low over a stack of ledgers. "It does not become a woman in your position to meddle in matters better left to men who understand them." "I am not meddling," Alara said, without looking up. "I am learning. There is a difference. Though I understand, it may not always be visible to those who have never needed to learn anything themselves." It was a bold thing to say to the Dowager Duchess of Kane, and Alara knew it the moment the words left her mouth. But she had spent a lifetime watching her father's estate collapse under the weight of pride, too stubborn to ask questions, and she refused to repeat that mistake, simply because propriety demanded silence from her. Margaret said nothing for a long moment, studying her daughter-in-law with an expression that had shifted, almost imperceptibly, from disdain toward something more careful. Whatever she had expected when Alara arrived soaked and abandoned in the storm, it had not been this quiet, unshakable resolve. "My son will return eventually," Margaret said finally, "and when he does, he will decide what becomes of this marriage." "Perhaps," Alara replied, closing the ledger before her with a soft, deliberate motion. "But until that day arrives, I intend to ensure there remains an estate worth returning to." She did not say the rest of what she was thinking. That a man who could leave his own wedding without a word did not seem, to her, like a man whose judgment she trusted to determine anyone's fate, least of all her own. She kept that thought carefully behind her calm expression, tucked away beside the notebook full of Foley's crimes, waiting for the moment when both would prove useful. That night, as she finally allowed herself to rest, Alara looked out her small window at the moonlit fields of Kane land stretching toward the dark horizon, fields that belonged, on paper, to a husband who had not thought her worth a single day's delay. She thought of her mother's old saying, the one she had repeated so often in the last months of her illness, that a person's true worth was measured not by who chose to stay, but by what they built when everyone else had gone. Alara pressed her palm briefly against the cold glass, watching her own breath fog it in the darkness, and made herself a quiet promise. She would not wait in this house like a forgotten guest, hoping for a husband's return to grant her a place within it. She would build that place herself, brick by brick, ledger by ledger, until whatever man eventually walked back through those gates found not the timid bride he had left behind, but a woman who had made this land, in every way that mattered, entirely her own. The storm outside had long since passed, but something new was gathering on the horizon of Kane Manor, quieter, and far more dangerous than any thunder. A reckoning that would arrive not with lightning, but with patience, ledgers, and the steady, unstoppable will of a woman no one had thought to take seriously. Alara Whitmore intended to make certain that mistake was never repeated. The following morning began not with silence, but with the sound of raised voices echoing down the east corridor, sharp enough to pull Alara from her room before she had finished pinning her hair. She followed the noise to the estate office, where she found Foley standing red-faced before an unfamiliar man in a rain-spattered coat, a farmer by the look of his hands, gesturing furiously toward a stack of papers on the desk. 3 months, the farmer was saying, his voice cracking with frustration. 3 months, I've paid my rent on time, and now you tell me the records show I owe from a season I already settled? Foley's eyes darted toward the doorway and found Alara watching from the threshold. Something flickered across his face, quickly smoothed into practiced calm. A clerical matter, my lady. Nothing that need concern the household. It concerns me a great deal, Alara said, stepping fully into the room, when a tenant of this estate is treated unjustly under my roof. The farmer, whose name she would learn was Garrick, turned to her with the wary hope of a man who had exhausted every other avenue and found only walls. She listened to his account in full, asked to see his own private record of payments, a battered notebook he had kept faithfully for years, and compared it, item by item, against the ledger Foley presented. The discrepancy was immediate and undeniable. A payment recorded as missing, that Garrick's notebook proved, had been made in full, witnessed by 2 other tenants who had stood beside him at the collection window. There must be some confusion in the transcription, Foley said quickly, reaching for the ledger as though to correct it on the spot. Leave it, Alara said, and something in her voice made him still his hand immediately. I will review the matter myself and settle it directly with Mr. Garrick. You may return to your other duties. Foley's jaw tightened, but he had no ground to stand on, not with a tenant present and witnesses to the dispute. He withdrew, and Alara spent the next hour with Garrick, resolving the discrepancy in his favor, apologizing on behalf of a household that had, however unknowingly on her part, wronged him. When he left, his gratitude was so plain and so unexpected that it settled something in her chest she had not realized needed settling. It was the first time since her arrival that someone in this cold, echoing house had looked at her with something other than pity or suspicion. It was the first time she had felt, however briefly, like a woman capable of righting a wrong rather than simply enduring one. That single encounter spread through the tenant farms faster than she could have anticipated. Within days, other farmers began arriving at the estate office with their own private ledgers, their own quiet grievances they had never dared voice to Foley directly, trusting instead in the new Duchess who had proven herself willing to listen. Alara met each of them in turn, comparing records, uncovering a pattern of small thefts and miscalculations that, added together, painted a picture far larger than she had first imagined. Foley grew more careful in her presence, but carefulness could not undo months, perhaps years, of accumulated deception. Alara began keeping her own shadow ledger, a private accounting that mirrored the estate's official records, but corrected every discrepancy she uncovered, building, page by page, an unshakable case against a man who had believed himself untouchable in an absent duke's house. She did not act rashly, she understood, with the same instinct that had guided her through her father's financial ruin, that confronting Foley too early, without complete proof, would only give him time to destroy evidence or flee with whatever he had stolen. So she waited, watched, and gathered, even as the Dowager Duchess grew increasingly uneasy at the quiet authority Alara was accumulating within a household that had, until her arrival, dismissed her as an afterthought. It was during this careful, patient work that Alara first noticed the deeper rot beneath the surface of Cane Manor's troubles. The harvest reports, when she finally gained access to them, showed yields far below what the fertile land should have produced, and a debt owed to a neighboring house, the Grenfells, that had grown quietly larger with each passing season, buried in footnotes and adjustments no one but a truly determined reader would ever think to question. She understood then that Foley's theft, however significant, was only one symptom of a household left to drift without a steady hand at its helm. The real danger lay ahead, in a debt coming due, and a harvest that would not cover it, a crisis that would arrive whether or not her absent husband ever returned to face it. Alara closed her private ledger that evening with a steadiness she had not expected to feel. She had come to Cane Manor as an unwanted bride, discarded before she had even arrived. She would not leave it, whatever happened next, as a woman who had simply waited for ruin to arrive and swallow her whole. Whatever storm was gathering on the horizon of this estate, she intended to meet it standing, and she intended to meet it prepared. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived on a gray afternoon, 3 weeks after Alara's arrival, sooner than she had planned, but forced by circumstances beyond her control. A courier rode through the gates at a gallop, mud-splattered and breathless, carrying a sealed letter from the Grenfell estate demanding immediate settlement of a debt that had, according to the letter, been quietly accumulating for over a year without proper payment. Alara intercepted the letter before it could reach Foley's desk, a small act of caution that would prove decisive. She read it twice by the window of her room, her stomach tightening with each line. The sum demanded was staggering, far larger than anything the estate's visible accounts could easily produce, and the tone of the letter carried an unmistakable threat beneath its formal courtesy. Pay within the month, or the Grenfells would begin proceedings to seize a portion of Kane land as collateral against the unpaid balance. She summoned Foley to the estate office that same afternoon, her private ledger open on the desk before her, every discrepancy she had uncovered laid out in careful, damning order. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Explain this," she said, turning the ledger toward him, "and explain it honestly, or I will have no choice but to bring these records before the magistrate myself." Foley's composure finally cracked. He argued, first, that she misunderstood complex accounting practices beyond her training. When she countered each excuse with a specific date, a specific sum, a specific tenant's testimony, his arguments crumbled into stammered half-truths, and finally, into silence. He had, over the course of nearly 2 years, quietly diverted a significant portion of the estate's income into his own accounts, using the Duke's prolonged absences and the Dowager's disinterest in daily management to cover his tracks. Alara did not have him arrested that day, though she considered it. Instead, she made him a proposition that surprised him more than any accusation could have. He would return what remained of the stolen funds, assist her in fully untangling every falsified entry in the ledgers, and depart Kane land quietly within the week, without a public scandal that would embarrass the family further than it already had been embarrassed by its absent lord. In exchange, she would not pursue formal charges that might see him imprisoned. It was mercy, but it was also strategy. A public trial would have taken months, drawn unwanted attention to the estate's vulnerabilities, at precisely the moment the Grenfell debt threatened to expose them further, and given Foley every opportunity to claim, in his own defense, that a young and inexperienced wife had misunderstood matters of estate management. Quiet resolution served her far better than public vindication, however satisfying the latter might have felt. Foley agreed, recognizing he had no better option remaining to him. Within days, he had returned a portion of what he had taken, corrected the falsified entries under Alara's watchful supervision, and departed Kane land without ceremony, leaving behind a household that breathed, almost audibly, with relief. The Dowager Duchess, informed of the theft and its resolution, said little at first. She sat in her morning room for a long while after Alara explained what had happened, her tea growing cold beside her, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice carried none of its previous coldness. "How long had this been happening?" she asked. "Nearly 2 years, by my calculations," Alara said. "And no one noticed." "No one looked," Alara corrected gently. "There is a difference." Margaret said nothing further that day, but something in the household shifted after that conversation. The servants, who had watched Alara's investigation unfold with cautious curiosity, now regarded her with something closer to genuine respect. Nora began seeking her out for small conversations during the day, sharing news of the household with a warmth she had reserved, until now, only for those she trusted. Emrys began consulting her directly about the garden's restoration, no longer routing every request through channels that had, for years, quietly starved his work of funding. But the resolution of Foley's theft had bought Alara time, not safety. The Grenfell debt remained, larger than the estate's current accounts could easily cover, and the harvest reports she had reviewed painted a troubling picture of yields that had fallen year after year, the fertile land of Kane, producing less each season under management too distracted, or too corrupt, to notice the slow decline. She rode out to the fields herself, something no lady of the house had apparently done in living memory, judging by the startled reactions of the tenant farmers, who saw her dismount at the edge of their land, in a plain riding habit, sleeves rolled to the elbow, asking questions about soil and rotation, and drainage, with the seriousness of someone who intended to understand every detail, rather than merely appear concerned for appearances. What she found troubled her deeply. Fields that should have been rotated to preserve the soil's strength had been planted with the same crop season after season. A shortcut Foley had likely encouraged to maximize immediate yield, while quietly ignoring the long-term damage. Drainage ditches that should have been cleared each autumn had been left choked with debris for years, flooding the lower fields each spring and drowning crops before they could mature. It was not a single failure. It was an accumulation of neglect, each small oversight compounding the next, until an estate that should have thrived on some of the richest land in the county instead limped from season to season, one poor harvest away from ruin. Alara understood, walking those fields with mud soaking through her boots and the autumn wind cutting sharp against her face, that saving Cane land would require more than uncovering a single thief. It would require rebuilding, patiently and completely, a system that had been allowed to rot from the inside for years, while the men responsible for its care looked the other way, distracted by pride, absence, or simple indifference. She began that work immediately, calling together the tenant farmers for a meeting unlike any they had known before, one where the lady of the house sat among them rather than above them, asking for their knowledge rather than dictating terms from a distance. Many of these farmers had worked cane land for generations, and their families carried within them knowledge of soil and season that no ledger could capture. Alara listened to every suggestion, weighed each against what she had read in agricultural treatises she had sent for, from the county's largest bookseller, and began drafting a plan to restore the land's fertility over the coming seasons. It would not solve the immediate crisis. The Grenfell debt still loomed, its deadline drawing closer with each passing week, and no amount of careful planning could summon a harvest that had already failed months before her arrival. But it was a beginning, a foundation upon which something lasting might eventually be built, provided the estate survived the immediate danger long enough to see those changes bear fruit. The Grenfell letter's deadline arrived faster than Alara would have liked, and with it, the first true test of everything she had built in her brief time at Cane Manor. She could have written to her husband, wherever he was on the continent, informing him of the crisis and begging him to return before the family's holdings were seized. Pride alone might have driven a lesser woman to that choice, if only to shift the burden of failure onto shoulders other than her own. Instead, Alara requested an audience with Lord Grenfell directly, a request so bold that even Dunbar, upon delivering the message, hesitated before informing her that Lord Grenfell had agreed to receive her, though his tone in doing so had carried, according to the messenger who returned with his reply, a note of amused curiosity rather than respect. She rode to Grenfell Hall 3 days later, accompanied only by Dunbar for propriety's sake, carrying with her a complete and honest accounting of Cane land's finances, including the theft she had uncovered and resolved, the damage to the fields she had already begun repairing, and a proposed schedule for repaying the debt over an extended term, rather than the immediate lump sum the original letter had demanded. Lord Grenfell received her in a study lined with hunting trophies and heavy oak furniture, a broad man with a calculating gaze that assessed her the moment she entered, clearly expecting either tears, excuses, or the timid deference of a woman sent to plead on behalf of a husband too cowardly to face his own debts. He found none of these things. Alara laid her ledgers before him without preamble, walked him through every figure with the same calm precision she had used to expose Foley's theft, and proposed a repayment structure that would satisfy the debt in full over 3 years, secured against the estate's improving harvests, rather than an immediate seizure of land that would, she pointed out plainly, benefit neither party nearly as much as a functioning estate paying its debts in full over time. "You understand," Grenfell said slowly, studying her with new interest, "that I could simply refuse this proposal and take the land now, as the original terms allow." "You could," Alara agreed, "but a portion of struggling farmland gains you far less than the full value of a debt repaid in coin, especially once you understand, as I do, precisely how much that land is capable of producing under proper management. I am offering you the better outcome, Lord Grenfell, not out of desperation, but because it is, quite simply, the more profitable choice. Grenfell studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted from calculation toward genuine respect. The particular respect one shrewd negotiator offers another, once recognized as an equal rather than dismissed as an obstacle. He agreed, in the end, to her terms, adjusted only slightly in his own favor, terms Alara had anticipated and built room for within her original proposal. She rode back to Kane Manor that evening, with the signed agreement secured in her satchel, exhausted but steady, having averted a crisis that would have crippled the estate for a generation, using nothing but honesty, careful preparation, and a refusal to be underestimated simply because of her age or her sex. News of the negotiation spread through the county faster than Alara could have anticipated, carried by servants, by tenant farmers, by the merchants who supplied Kane Manor and had watched, with growing curiosity, as the young Duchess transformed a household on the verge of collapse into one steadily, visibly, recovering. Within weeks, she was no longer spoken of merely as the Duke's abandoned bride. She had become, in the whispered conversations of the county's finest drawing rooms, the Duchess who had saved Kane land with her own hands, while her husband remained conveniently absent, chasing whatever business he deemed more important than the wife and estate he had left behind. The invitation arrived on a crisp morning in early winter, carried by a royal messenger whose formal livery drew the attention of every servant in the house before the letter even reached Alara's hands. It bore the seal of the royal court, requesting her presence at a gathering held in honor of the county's most notable landholders, an event she would, under ordinary circumstances, never have expected to attend as the wife of an absent and largely disgraced duke. She understood, reading the letter twice by the morning light, that word of her success with the Grenfell negotiation and the restoration of Kane land had traveled further than she had realized, reaching ears in the capital itself. The Dowager Duchess, when informed of the invitation, regarded it with an expression Alara had learned to recognize as grudging admiration, though Margaret would never have described it in such generous terms herself. "You will need proper gowns," Margaret said instead, setting down her tea with unusual briskness, "and a proper escort. I suppose I shall have to accompany you myself, since my son cannot be bothered to attend to such matters." It was, in its own way, the closest thing to an apology Margaret had offered since Alara's arrival. An acknowledgement, however indirect, that her son's absence had left gaps only Alara herself had bothered to fill. Alara accepted the offer with genuine gratitude, and the two women spent the following days in a flurry of preparation that felt, for the first time since the storm that had brought her to Kane Manor, almost like the beginnings of a family, rather than a household enduring one another out of necessity. The gathering itself was held at Thornwick Hall, a grand estate belonging to a family of considerable influence at court, and Alara arrived alongside Margaret, in a gown of deep blue silk that had been altered, in a matter of days, from one of the dowager's own gowns, a gesture that carried more warmth than either woman spoke aloud. The hall glittered with candlelight and conversation, filled with figures whose names Alara had only ever encountered in the pages of county newspapers, and she felt, for a brief moment upon entering, the same uncertainty that had gripped her the night she arrived soaked and forgotten at Kane Manor's gates. That uncertainty did not last long. Word of her achievements had preceded her, and within the first hour, she found herself approached by landholders, eager to hear, firsthand, how a young woman with no formal training in estate management had uncovered a theft that had gone unnoticed for years, restored fields that had been neglected to the point of ruin, and negotiated a debt settlement that had, by all accounts, left even the shrewd Lord Grenfell impressed. It was during one such conversation, held near a tall window overlooking Thornwick's frost-covered gardens, that Alara first met Lord Cassian Vane, an advisor to the Crown Prince himself, a man whose reputation for sharp judgment and careful diplomacy preceded him in every circle she had encountered that evening. He was younger than she had expected, with an easy manner that concealed, she would soon learn, a mind every bit as calculating as her own, though tempered by a warmth that Alaric Kane had never once shown her. "I confess," Cassian said, joining the small circle of admirers surrounding her with the effortless confidence of a man accustomed to court gatherings. "I came to Thornwick tonight, specifically hoping to meet the Duchess who has become the most discussed topic in every letter arriving from the county this month." "I hope the discussion has been favorable," Ilara said, though she suspected, given the amused glint in his eye, that he already knew the answer. "More than favorable," Cassian replied. "There are members of the royal court, Lady Kane, who speak of little else. A woman managing an estate's recovery single-handedly, negotiating with the notoriously difficult Lord Grenfell, and doing so, from what I understand, entirely without the aid of the husband whose name she carries. It is not a story easily ignored, whatever one's position at court." There was no cruelty in his observation of Alaric's absence, only a careful, measured curiosity, and Ilara found herself grateful for the lack of pity that so often colored others' references to her husband's disappearance. She spoke with Cassian for the better part of an hour that evening, discussing not merely her own accomplishments, but broader matters of estate management, agricultural reform, and the growing concern among certain circles at court regarding the state of the kingdom's rural economy, a subject she found herself engaging with a passion she had not realized she possessed, until that very conversation drew it forth. Cassian listened with genuine attention, occasionally offering observations of his own that revealed a depth of understanding she had not expected from a court advisor more accustomed, she had assumed, to matters of diplomacy than agriculture. By the evening's end, he had made her a proposal that surprised her nearly as much as Lord Grenfell's earlier respect had. "There is a royal commission being formed," he explained, "to address the decline of rural estates across several counties, holdings much like Cane land was before your arrival. The Crown Prince has expressed interest in identifying individuals with practical experience in reversing such decline, rather than relying solely on theoretical advisors who have never once walked a struggling field themselves. I would like to recommend you for a position on that commission, Lady Kane, if you would consider it." The offer stunned her, not merely for the honor it represented, but for what it implied about how far she had already traveled from the frightened, abandoned bride who had arrived at Cane Manor's gates in a storm only months before. She accepted, cautiously at first, and then with growing conviction as Cassian outlined the commission's scope and the influence it might carry in shaping policy that could benefit struggling estates throughout the kingdom, not merely her own. She returned to Cane Manor that night with Margaret at her side, the carriage rattling comfortably along roads far calmer than the storm that had first brought her to this place, and found herself reflecting on how completely her circumstances had transformed in the span of a single season. She had arrived as an unwanted obligation, discarded before her marriage had even begun. She was returning, now, as a woman whose name had reached the ears of the Crown Prince's own court, recommended for a position of genuine influence, respected by figures who had never once considered her husband's absence a mark against her. Margaret, watching her in the candle-lit interior of the carriage, broke the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "My son," she said slowly, "has no idea what he left behind in that storm." Ilara said nothing in response, though the observation settled somewhere deep within her, a quiet seed of understanding that would, in the months to come, grow into something far larger than either woman could have anticipated that night. The weeks that followed brought Ilara deeper into the workings of the Royal Commission, correspondence arriving regularly from Cassian and other members appointed to the project, each letter drawing her further into a world of policy and influence she had never imagined accessible to a woman in her position. She began traveling to the capital periodically, always accompanied by Margaret or a trusted member of the household staff, meeting with landholders and officials whose combined influence over the kingdom's agricultural future rivaled that of any single duke. She did not neglect Cane land during this time. If anything, her growing understanding of broader agricultural policy sharpened her approach to the estate's own recovery, and the fields that had once lain neglected and flooded began, season by season, to show signs of renewed health under the careful rotation and drainage improvements she had implemented. The tenant farmers, who had watched her walk their fields in mud-soaked boots on her very first visit, now greeted her with genuine warmth whenever she rode out to review their progress, a transformation in relationship that Foley's years of neglect had never once achieved. The Commission's work, meanwhile, brought her into increasingly frequent contact with Cassian Vane, whose respect for her judgment grew evident in ways he made little effort to conceal. He sought her counsel on matters extending well beyond agricultural policy, valuing an insight she had earned not through inherited title, but through the hard, practical work of rebuilding something broken with her own hands. Their conversations, whether conducted in formal meeting halls or during the quieter moments before and after such gatherings, carried a warmth that Alara found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, looking forward to with increasing anticipation. She did not allow herself to dwell overlong on what that warmth might signify. She remained, after all, a married woman, however distant and neglectful her husband had proven himself to be, and she understood the precariousness of her position too well to entertain feelings that could, if discovered, undo everything she had so carefully built. But she noticed, all the same, the particular ease she felt in Cassian's company, an ease entirely absent from her memories of the brief dinner she had once shared with the man whose name she still legally carried. It was during a formal ceremony held at the royal court itself, one recognizing the commission's early findings and the landholders whose estates had shown the most significant improvement under new management practices, that Alara's transformation received its most public acknowledgement yet. Standing before an assembly that included members of the Crown Prince's own household, she was formally commended for her work in restoring Cane land, her name recorded in documents that would, in time, carry weight far beyond the county she called home. The Crown Prince himself, a reserved man not given to excessive praise, offered a brief but pointed remark that would echo through court gossip for weeks afterward, observing that it was rare, in his experience, to find a landholder who understood both the ledger and the land itself as thoroughly as the Duchess of Cane appeared to. It was, by the standards of a court not easily impressed, high praise indeed, and it marked, unmistakably, the moment when Alara Whitmore ceased to be spoken of as an abandoned bride, and became known, in her own right, as a woman of genuine consequence. She returned to Cane Manor that evening, carrying a formal commendation bearing the royal seal, a document that would, in the months to come, prove far more significant than she could have anticipated, though she did not yet know precisely how. What she did know, standing once more at the window of her room and looking out over fields that had, under her patient care, begun to flourish again, was that whatever man eventually returned through Cane Manor's gates would find a household, an estate, and a wife utterly transformed from the ones he had so carelessly left behind. She did not know, that quiet winter evening, precisely when that return would come, but she understood, with a certainty that had grown steadily alongside every triumph of the past months, that she would meet it not as a woman waiting to be judged, but as one prepared, at last, to do the judging herself. The letter announcing Alaric Cane's return arrived without warning, on a bright morning, nearly 2 years after the storm that had first brought Alara to his gates, delivered not by his own hand, but by a brief, almost careless note from a port official, confirming his ship had docked, and that His Grace would arrive at Cane Manor within the week. There was no explanation for the length of his absence, no apology for the silence that had stretched across 2 full years without a single letter passing between husband and wife, only a curt announcement of his impending arrival, as though he expected the household to simply resume as he had left it. Alara read the letter twice at her writing desk, the same desk where she had once copied Foley's fraudulent entries into a private notebook, now covered instead with correspondence from the Royal Commission and reports from tenant farmers whose harvests had, for the 2nd consecutive year, exceeded every projection she had dared to hope for when she first walked those neglected fields in mud-soaked boots. She felt no surge of anticipation at the news, no eagerness to see the man whose face she barely remembered clearly after 2 years apart. What she felt, instead, was a calm, settled curiosity about how he would react to what he found upon his return. She did not rush to prepare the household in his honor. She continued her work, as she had for the past 2 years, reviewing the Commission's latest reports, meeting with tenant farmers to discuss the coming season's planting, and corresponding with Cassian regarding a proposal that would, if approved, extend the successful practices developed at Cane Land to 3 neighboring estates struggling with similar decline. If Alaric expected fanfare upon his return, she intended to offer him nothing of the sort. He would find the household exactly as it was, functioning, prosperous, and utterly indifferent to his sudden reappearance. He arrived on a mild afternoon, his carriage rattling through gates that no longer sagged on rusted hinges, but swung smoothly on ironwork Alara had ordered repaired during her first autumn at Cane Manor. Dunbar greeted him at the door with the same measured formality he offered any visitor of consequence, and it was that formality, more than anything else, that seemed to unsettle Alaric before he had even crossed the threshold. "Dunbar," he said, glancing around the great hall with visible confusion. "The place looks different." "Much has changed since your Grace's departure," Dunbar replied, his tone giving away nothing of his own opinion on the matter, though the faint satisfaction in his eyes suggested he took some quiet pleasure in the observation. Alara met her husband for the first time in 2 years in the same estate office where she had once confronted Foley, seated behind a desk covered in ledgers and correspondence that bore, unmistakably, the marks of a household under careful and competent management. Alaric entered looking somewhat travel-worn, his fine coat showing signs of a fortune diminished rather than grown during his absence, and stopped short upon seeing her, as though he had expected to find someone else entirely occupying that chair. "Ilara," he said, and there was surprise in his voice, though whether at her presence or her composure, she could not immediately tell. "I had thought to find you in the family wing." "I have found the estate office rather more useful to my time," she replied, setting down her pen with deliberate calm. "Welcome home, Your Grace. I trust your business abroad concluded successfully." The faint edge in her tone was not lost on him, and something flickered across his face, an uncertainty that had clearly not been part of whatever plan had brought him back to Caneland after 2 years of silence. He glanced at the ledgers spread before her, at the royal seal visible on a folded letter near her elbow, and his confusion deepened into something closer to alarm. "I had understood," he said slowly, choosing his words with visible care, "that matters here would require some reorganizing upon my return. I have made certain arrangements that I believe will need to be discussed." Ilara understood, in that single carefully constructed sentence, precisely what he had come home intending to do. He had left believing he could return whenever suited him, dissolve an inconvenient marriage that had never truly begun, and remake his life, according to whatever political arrangement his failed diplomatic mission had left him needing to pursue instead. He had not anticipated finding a wife whose position within the household, within the county, and within the very halls of the royal court itself, had grown far beyond anything he could easily dismiss. "What arrangements would those be?" she asked, keeping her voice level, though she already suspected the answer. Alaric hesitated, clearly recalculating whatever speech he had rehearsed during his journey home. "I had thought," he said finally, "given the nature of our marriage and the time that has passed, that perhaps an annulment might be arranged, allowing us both to pursue arrangements more suited to our respective circumstances." It was, Ilara reflected, almost impressive in its bluntness, the sheer audacity of a man who had abandoned his wife on their wedding day, left her to fend for herself in a house full of strangers for 2 years, without so much as a letter, and now returned, expecting her to simply agree to being cast aside a second time, as though nothing had changed in the interim to alter the balance of power between them. "I see," she said calmly. "And what circumstances, precisely, have made such an arrangement necessary, at this particular moment?" Alaric's composure slipped, just slightly, at the directness of her question. "The mission abroad did not proceed as planned," he admitted, choosing his words carefully. "Certain financial obligations arose that I had not anticipated. A more advantageous match has been suggested to me, one that would help resolve those obligations, provided our own marriage could be dissolved quietly and without complication." There it was, laid bare without even the courtesy of disguise. He had failed abroad, accumulated debts of his own, and returned home hoping to discard an inconvenient wife in favor of a wealthier arrangement that might rescue him from the consequences of his own poor judgment. Ilara felt, hearing this confession, not the hurt she might once have expected such words to cause, but something closer to quiet, almost amused disbelief at how little her husband understood about what had transpired in his absence. "I am afraid," she said, rising from her chair with the same calm authority she had once used to dismantle Foley's careful deceptions, "that matters are somewhat more complicated than you appear to realize." She gestured toward the ledgers spread across the desk, toward the correspondence bearing the royal seal, toward the window overlooking fields that had, under her management, transformed from a source of shame into the pride of the entire county. "This estate you left in ruin 2 years ago is now the most successfully managed holding in the region, a fact recognized personally by the Crown Prince's own commission. I hold a formal position advising on agricultural policy, that extends across 3 neighboring counties. The tenants who once feared losing their livelihoods to a corrupt steward now speak of this household with genuine gratitude. None of this, Your Grace, was accomplished by the man who currently stands before me, asking for a quiet and convenient annulment. Alaric's face had gone pale by the time she finished speaking, the full weight of what he had returned to finally settling over him. He had expected, evidently, to find the same frightened, forgotten bride he had abandoned 2 years earlier, a woman who might accept a quiet dissolution of their marriage without protest, grateful perhaps to be free of an arrangement neither of them had wanted. Instead, he found a duchess whose reputation and influence had, in his absence, grown to eclipse whatever remained of his own tarnished name. "The estate's finances," he said finally, his voice unsteady. "You have managed them yourself?" "Every aspect," Alara confirmed, "including uncovering and resolving a theft your steward committed under your own roof, negotiating a debt settlement with Lord Grenfell that saved this family from losing its lands entirely, and restoring harvests that had been failing for years before I ever arrived. I have done all of this, Your Grace, entirely without your assistance, guidance, or presence." Silence settled over the estate office, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire Alara had insisted be kept burning in every room throughout the winter months, another small change from the cold, neglected household she had first encountered 2 years before. Alaric stood before her, a man returned from failure abroad, only to discover that the wife he had discarded without a second thought had, in his absence, built something he could no longer simply dismantle at his convenience. "I did not know," he said quietly, and for the first time since his arrival, something genuine seemed to color his voice, though whether it was regret or simply the shock of recalculating his own circumstances, Alara could not yet tell. "I had not thought you capable of any of this." "No," she agreed, her tone even, but unmistakably firm. "You did not think of me at all, Your Grace. That has rather been the difficulty from the beginning." She watched him absorb the full weight of that observation, watched the plans he had carried home across the sea crumble before her eyes into something far more uncertain than he had anticipated. Whatever he had expected upon his return to Cane Manor, it had not been this, and Alara understood, with a clarity that steadied rather than unsettled her, that the balance between them had shifted permanently and irrevocably in her favor. The days following Alaric's return brought a steady stream of revelations that further eroded whatever authority he had hoped to reclaim within his own household. The Dowager Duchess, who had once dismissed Alara as an inconvenient obligation, now deferred openly to her judgment on matters ranging from tenant disputes to household expenditures, a shift in loyalty that Alaric noted with growing unease each time he attempted to assert some measure of control, only to find his own mother siding, without hesitation, with his wife. "You must understand," Margaret told him privately, during one particularly tense supper where Alaric had attempted, unsuccessfully, to override a decision Alara had made regarding the estate's grain reserves, "that this household survived your absence because of her judgment, not despite it. I will not see 2 years of careful rebuilding undone simply because you have returned and wish to feel important again." It was, perhaps, the harshest thing Margaret had ever said to her son, and Alara, seated across the table and watching the exchange unfold, felt no satisfaction in witnessing it, only a quiet recognition that the household's loyalties had realigned themselves naturally around competence and consistency, rather than title alone. Alaric had returned expecting to reclaim a position he had never truly earned in the first place, and found instead that 2 years of absence had cost him something far more valuable than mere affection. It had cost him the trust and respect of every person within his own household, trust that Alara had built patiently, deliberately, through 2 years of work he had never once witnessed. Word of Alaric's return, and of the stark contrast between his failed venture abroad and his wife's flourishing reputation, spread through the county with the same swift efficiency that had once carried news of her triumph over the Grenfell debt. Letters arrived at Cane Manor from families who had once looked upon the marriage with pity, now seeking Alara's counsel on estate matters of their own, addressing their correspondence directly to her rather than to the Duke, whose name technically headed the household. A formal letter arrived as well from the royal court itself, confirming Alara's commendation from the Agricultural Commission had been entered into official record, alongside a note indicating the Crown Prince intended to expand her role within the commission to oversee reforms across a wider stretch of territory than originally proposed. It was a significant honor, one that placed her influence squarely above anything her husband's own family name had ever achieved, and the timing of its arrival, mere days after Alaric's disastrous homecoming, could not have illustrated the reversal of their fortunes more clearly had it been deliberately arranged. Alaric's own family, meanwhile, found themselves leaning ever more heavily on connections Alara had cultivated during his absence. A cousin of his, Lord Percival Kane, arrived at the manor, seeking assistance with a debt of his own, one he had previously assumed the Duke himself would settle through family obligation. He found, upon arrival, that the household's finances, and the influence required to negotiate favorable terms with creditors, rested entirely in Alara's capable hands, and he was forced to appeal to her directly, addressing her with a deference he would never have offered 2 years earlier. "I confess," Percival admitted during one uncomfortable conversation in the estate office, "I had not expected to find myself asking a favor of you, Lady Kane, rather than my cousin." "Circumstances change," Alara replied simply, reviewing his request with the same measured attention she offered every matter that crossed her desk. She agreed, in the end, to assist him, not out of any particular fondness for a man who had, like the rest of his family, once treated her with careless disregard, but because she understood that goodwill extended, even to those who had wronged her, carried its own quiet value, building a reputation for fairness that served her far better than resentment ever could. Alaric watched these exchanges unfold with mounting frustration, his attempts to reassert some measure of authority within his own household, growing increasingly desperate as each effort met with the same quiet, unshakable resistance. He summoned Foley's replacement, a steward Alara had personally selected and trained over the previous year, and attempted to countermand several of her recent decisions regarding the estate's grain reserves, only to be informed, politely but firmly, that such matters now required the Duchess's approval as well as his own, a condition that had been formally established during his absence and recorded in updated household protocols he had never bothered to read. Frustrated, he sought legal counsel of his own, hoping to find some avenue by which he might reclaim full authority over the estate without Alara's involvement. What he discovered instead, delivered by a lawyer he had summoned specifically to resolve the matter in his favor, left him staring at documents he barely remembered signing, buried within the original marriage contract drafted nearly 3 years earlier. "There is a clause here," the lawyer explained carefully, spreading the original contract across the desk between them, granting the Duchess independent authority over estate management decisions in circumstances where the Duke is absent for an extended period without appointing a formal steward of equal standing. "Given that your Grace departed for 2 years without such an appointment, and given the extensive record of decisions made and formally documented during that period, this clause appears to have taken full legal effect." Alaric stared at the document, at his own signature affixed beside a clause he had clearly never bothered to read in full before their hurried marriage, and understood, with a sinking certainty, that his own carelessness had handed his wife a legal standing within the estate that he could not easily overturn, even now that he had returned. "Surely, this can be contested," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than the words themselves suggested. "It could be contested," the lawyer agreed carefully, "though I would advise against it, Your Grace. The Duchess's management of the estate during your absence is a matter of extensive public record, praised by neighboring landholders, tenant farmers, and indeed the royal court itself. Any legal challenge would require demonstrating mismanagement or incompetence on her part, a case that would be, given the evidence available, exceedingly difficult to make convincingly before any magistrate." Alaric sat in silence for a long while after the lawyer departed, alone in the estate office that had once been entirely his own domain, now transformed into a space where his wife's judgment carried equal, if not greater weight than his own title. He thought of the 2 years he had spent abroad, chasing a diplomatic appointment that had ultimately failed, accumulating debts he had hoped to resolve through a convenient dissolution of his marriage, never once imagining that the woman he had so carelessly discarded might return the favor by building, in his absence, an authority he could no longer simply dismiss. He found Alara later that evening in the small drawing room where she had once dried her rain-soaked cloak on her very first night at Kane Manor, now warmed by a steady fire, and furnished with the quiet comforts she had gradually introduced throughout the household. She looked up from a letter she was drafting, her expression calm and unreadable, as he entered. "I understand," he said slowly, "that the contract grants you certain authorities I had not anticipated." "It does," she confirmed, setting down her pen. "I did not draft that clause myself, Your Grace. I simply understood, from the moment I arrived and found myself abandoned in a storm, that I would need to protect my own position within this household, given how little consideration you had shown for it thus far." "And now?" he asked, and there was something almost plaintive in the question. A man searching for some path back to authority he had never truly earned. "What do you intend to do with that authority?" Alara studied him for a long moment, weighing her response carefully. She felt no particular anger toward him in that moment, only a clear-eyed recognition of exactly what kind of man she had married, and exactly how far she had traveled from the frightened bride who had once wept alone in a cold, unfamiliar room. "I intend," she said finally, "to continue managing this estate, as I have for the past 2 years, competently and honestly, for the benefit of every person who depends upon it, myself included. Whether you choose to be a genuine partner in that work, or simply an obstacle to it, remains entirely your own decision, Your Grace." She returned her attention to her letter, a clear signal that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion, and Alaric withdrew from the room without further protest, understanding, perhaps for the first time since his return, that the woman he had abandoned held every advantage in whatever remained of their marriage, and that no amount of title or lineage could easily reclaim what his own carelessness had surrendered. The weeks that followed saw Alaric attempt, with increasing desperation, to reassert some measure of relevance within a household that had learned to function admirably without him. He proposed changes to the estate's management that Alara politely but firmly declined, citing evidence from the very ledgers he had never bothered to examine himself. He attempted to reconnect with tenant farmers who had once looked to him for leadership, only to find they now addressed their concerns directly to the Duchess, trusting her judgment far more readily than his own unfamiliar face. Even his own mother, when he sought her support in reclaiming greater authority, offered him little comfort. "You had 2 years, Alaric," Margaret told him plainly, during a conversation Alara only later learned had taken place. 2 years to write a single letter, to send word of your circumstances, to show even the smallest consideration for the woman you married. She built all of this from nothing, while you built nothing at all, beyond the debts you now expect her authority to help you escape. I will not pretend otherwise, simply because you have finally returned to claim credit for work you never once contributed toward." It was, perhaps, the clearest articulation of the household's collective judgment, spoken by the one person whose opinion Alaric had always valued above all others. He found himself, in the months following his return, increasingly isolated within his own home, a duke in title only, while the true authority over Cane land rested firmly, and by every measure fairly, in the hands of the wife he had once considered nothing more than an inconvenient obligation to be quietly discarded. It was during a visit to the capital for the Commission's quarterly review, held some months after Alaric's uneasy return to Cane Manor, that Cassian Vane finally spoke the words he had, Alara suspected, been carrying for longer than either of them had openly acknowledged. They had walked together through the palace gardens after the formal proceedings concluded, a habit they had developed over the preceding months, discussing matters of policy that gradually gave way, as their conversations often did, to subjects far more personal than agricultural reform. "I have watched you rebuild an entire estate from ruin," Cassian said, pausing beside a fountain, where the last of the autumn leaves drifted across still water, while receiving nothing in return, but neglect from the very man who should have valued you most. "I do not say this to speak ill of your husband, Alara, though I confess it is difficult to restrain myself on the matter. I say it because I have come to admire you, in a manner that extends well beyond our professional association, and I believe it would be dishonest of me to continue pretending otherwise." Alara stood very still beside the fountain, the cool autumn air settling around them, aware of the significant weight carried within his careful, measured words. She had known, for some time now, that her own feelings toward Cassian had grown beyond what propriety strictly allowed for a married woman, however neglected that marriage had proven to be. She had told herself, repeatedly, that such feelings were simply gratitude for his respect, his genuine interest in her judgment, the ease of conversation that had never once existed between herself and Alaric. But standing there in the fading autumn light, hearing him speak so plainly, she understood that gratitude alone could not fully explain the warmth that had settled in her chest. "Cassian," she said carefully, "I remain a married woman, whatever the state of that marriage may currently be." "I am aware," he replied, his gaze steady and without pretense. "I do not ask you to act rashly, or to abandon whatever considerations your position requires. I ask only that you know my regard for you is genuine, and that whatever choices lie ahead of you, regarding your marriage, your position, your own future, I would consider it an honor to support you in making them, whatever direction you ultimately choose." It was, Ilara reflected later that evening, alone in her chamber at the residence the commission maintained for its visiting members, an offer unlike anything she had ever received from her own husband, an offer of partnership rather than possession, of respect rather than obligation. She thought of the 2 years she had spent building Caneland into something worthy of pride, entirely without support from the man whose name she carried, and compared it against the quiet, steady support Cassian had offered her from the very first evening they met at Thornwick Hall. She did not respond to his declaration immediately, understanding the gravity of what any answer might set into motion. Her marriage to Alaric remained legally binding, however hollow it had become in practice, and any deeper involvement with Cassian carried risks that extended well beyond her own reputation, threatening the very authority and respect she had worked so carefully to build over the preceding years. She wrote to him, some days later, a careful letter acknowledging his regard without committing to any particular course of action, asking only for time to consider what her own heart, long neglected in favor of practical necessity, truly wanted from whatever future remained ahead of her. Cassian's response arrived within days, patient and understanding, offering her whatever time she required without pressure or expectation. It was, in its own quiet way, further proof of the fundamental difference between the two men who now occupied such significant positions within her considerations, one who had abandoned her without a second thought, and another who offered her patience and respect, even while confessing feelings that clearly ran deep. She returned to Cane Manor, carrying this unresolved question alongside the Commission's latest findings, aware that whatever decision she eventually reached regarding Cassian would need to wait until the more immediate matter of her marriage to Alaric found some resolution of its own. She did not yet know what that resolution might look like, whether it would involve a formal separation, a continued arrangement of convenience, or some other path she had not yet fully considered. But she understood, walking once more through the gates of the estate she had rebuilt with her own hands, that she would face whatever came next as she had faced every challenge before it, with clear judgment and an unwavering commitment to her own worth, regardless of what any man, whether husband or admirer, ultimately decided to offer her. The reckoning Alaric had perhaps always known was coming, arrived not through any dramatic confrontation, but through a quiet, devastating accumulation of small moments that finally forced him to confront the full weight of his own failures. He watched, throughout that winter, as tenant farmers who had once looked to him with hopeful deference now walked past him toward the estate office to seek his wife's counsel instead. He watched as his own mother, whose approval he had sought his entire life, spoke of Ilara's achievements with a pride she had never once extended toward his own accomplishments. He watched as invitations to gatherings throughout the county arrived, addressed specifically to the Duchess, with his own name included, if at all, as an afterthought. It was during a particularly difficult evening, when a letter arrived confirming that Ilara's role within the Royal Commission had been expanded once again, this time to include formal advisory status that placed her in direct, regular contact with the Crown Prince's own council, that Alaric finally allowed himself to sit with the full magnitude of what he had lost through his own carelessness. He found her that night in the estate office, reviewing the letter with the same calm focus she brought to every matter that crossed her desk, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, "though I suspect it arrives far too late to carry any real meaning." Ilara looked up from the letter, studying him carefully. She had wondered, more than once during the preceding months, whether such a moment would ever come, whether the man who had abandoned her so carelessly possessed the self-awareness necessary to recognize the full weight of what he had done. "Go on," she said simply, neither encouraging nor discouraging him from continuing. "I left you at the gates of this house without so much as a word of explanation, he said, his voice carrying a rawness she had never heard from him before. I did so because I resented the marriage itself, resented being told who I would spend my life with, rather than choosing for myself, and I took that resentment out on you, a woman who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. I told myself, during those 2 years abroad, that you would manage well enough, that my absence changed little for a marriage that had never truly begun in any meaningful sense. I did not imagine, not for a single moment, that you would build all of this, that you would become someone the entire kingdom speaks of with genuine admiration, while I accomplished nothing but my own failure, and return home, expecting to simply reclaim what I had so carelessly discarded. Alara listened to this confession in silence, feeling neither the satisfaction of vindication she might once have expected such words to bring, nor any softening of the clear-eyed judgment she had formed of him over the preceding years. "What is it you are asking of me, Alaric?" she said finally, using his given name for perhaps the first time since his return, a small gesture that seemed to carry significant weight in the quiet room. "I do not entirely know," he admitted, and there was an honesty in the admission that surprised her. "I do not believe I have any right to ask for reconciliation, given everything I have failed to earn. I ask only, perhaps, for the chance to prove that I have learned something from watching you these past months, that I am capable of becoming a partner worthy of the respect you have built for yourself, rather than continuing to be merely an obstacle to it." It was, Ilara reflected, a more honest and humble request than anything she had expected from the man who had once left her weeping alone, in a cold, unfamiliar room. She did not answer him immediately, understanding that whatever response she offered would shape the remainder of both their lives, and unwilling to make such a significant decision, without the same careful consideration she brought to every other matter of consequence. "I will consider what you have said," she told him finally, "but I want to be entirely clear, Alaric, that respect once lost is not simply restored through a single conversation, however sincere. You will need to demonstrate, through sustained and genuine effort, that the man standing before me tonight is not merely performing contrition in the hope of reclaiming what convenience once offered him, but has truly changed in the ways that matter most. I owe you nothing beyond fair consideration of that effort, should you choose to make it." Alaric nodded slowly, accepting the terms of her response with a humility that had been entirely absent from the man who had first arrived at Kane Manor's gates, expecting a quiet annulment. He withdrew from the office that night, carrying the full weight of understanding exactly how much he had lost, and exactly how much work lay ahead of him, should he ever hope to reclaim even a fraction of the respect he had so carelessly forfeited 2 years earlier. Spring arrived at Caneland with a warmth that seemed, to Alara, entirely different from the storm that had once marked her arrival at these same gates. The fields she had rebuilt with her own patient effort stretched green and thriving toward the horizon, tended now by farmers who greeted her with genuine affection whenever she rode out among them, and the manor itself, once cold and dim on that first terrible night, now hummed with the quiet, comfortable rhythm of a household that had learned, under her steady hand, how to truly function. In the months following Alaric's confession, she watched him carefully, weighing each small effort he made against the promises he had spoken that night in the estate office. He began attending tenant meetings alongside her, listening rather than dictating, asking questions of farmers whose names he had never once bothered to learn during his earlier years at Kane Manor. He read, for the first time, the full contents of the marriage contract he had signed so carelessly years before, and asked her, with what appeared to be genuine humility, to explain the reasoning behind decisions she had made in his absence, seeking understanding, rather than simply challenging her authority. It was not a swift transformation, nor a complete one. There remained moments when old habits surfaced, when Alaric's pride chafed against deferring to judgment he had once assumed was naturally his own to claim. But Alara noticed, gradually, a genuine shift in how he carried himself, a willingness to acknowledge fault rather than deflect it, a growing respect for the tenants and servants whose loyalty he had never once earned during his earlier years as Duke. She continued her correspondence with Cassian throughout this period, their letters carrying the same warmth and mutual respect that had first drawn her to him at Thornwick Hall, though she was careful, in every exchange, to maintain the boundaries her still unresolved marriage required. Cassian never pressed her for more than she was prepared to offer, content, it seemed, simply to remain a steady and trusted presence in her life, whatever form that presence ultimately took. It was during a visit to the capital that spring, called to finalize the commission's expanded charter across the neighboring counties, that Alara found herself faced with the question she had been quietly weighing for months. Cassian met her in the same palace gardens where he had first spoken his feelings aloud, the fountain now surrounded by new blossoms rather than fallen autumn leaves, and asked, gently, whether she had reached any clarity regarding her own heart. "I have watched my husband change these past months," she told him honestly, "in ways I did not expect, and in ways that leave me uncertain what the right path forward truly is. I built everything I now possess without his help, and I will not pretend that his recent efforts erase 2 years of careless abandonment. But I also cannot deny that he has, for the first time since our marriage began, shown genuine willingness to become the partner he should have been from the very start." Cassian listened to this without any visible disappointment, his regard for her steady, even as she spoke words that might have signaled the end of whatever future he had hoped they might share together. "Whatever you decide," he said finally, "know that my respect for you remains unchanged. You have built something remarkable, Alara, entirely through your own strength and judgment, and no decision you make now, regarding your marriage or otherwise, will diminish what you have already achieved." It was, in its own way, the final piece of clarity Alara needed. She understood, standing in that quiet garden, that her worth had never depended on which man ultimately stood beside her, whether the husband slowly learning to deserve her respect, or the admirer who had offered her steady partnership from the very beginning. She had built her own place in the world, through patience, intelligence, and an unwavering refusal to be discarded without a fight, and whatever choice she made moving forward would be hers alone, made from strength, rather than desperation or gratitude. She returned to Cane Manor that spring, with a decision finally settled in her heart, one she communicated first to Alaric in the same estate office where so much of their marriage's true business had always been conducted. She told him, plainly, that she was willing to continue their marriage, not out of obligation or the pressures of society, but because she had witnessed genuine change in him, and because the estate they had both, in their different ways, poured themselves into deserved, a future built on partnership rather than division. She told him, with equal clarity, that this decision came with conditions he would need to honor for the remainder of their lives together, conditions rooted in the respect and equality that had been so painfully absent from the earliest days of their union. Alaric accepted these terms without protest, understanding, at last, precisely what he had nearly lost through his own carelessness, and precisely what he would need to continue earning for as long as their marriage endured. Their partnership, in the years that followed, was never one built on romantic ideals or storybook devotion, but on something Alara had come to value far more highly, a genuine, hard-won respect between two people who had both, in their own ways, learned the true cost of taking each other for granted. She maintained her position within the Royal Commission for many years afterward, her influence eventually extending across the entire kingdom's approach to agricultural reform. Her name spoken with the same respect once reserved only for titled lords who had inherited their standing, rather than earning it through their own effort. Cane land itself became known throughout the realm as a model of prosperous, well-managed estate practice, visited by landholders eager to learn the methods that had transformed a struggling, neglected holding into one of the region's most successful. Cassian remained a trusted friend and colleague throughout the years that followed, their mutual respect never fading even as their paths diverged from the deeper connection that might once have grown between them. Alara never regretted the choice she made, understanding that true strength lay not in choosing between two men who admired her, but in recognizing that her own worth had never depended on either of their regard in the first place. She thought often, in the quiet years that followed, of the frightened young woman who had once stood soaked and abandoned at Cane Manor's gates, certain that her life had been decided for her, by a husband who could not be bothered to even meet her at the door. She thought of how easily that young woman might have simply waited, quietly and passively, for whatever fate a careless man chose to assign her, and how different her entire life might have unfolded had she chosen that path instead of the one she ultimately walked. She had built, through patience, intelligence, and an unwavering refusal to accept the diminished place others assigned her, a life entirely her own, one that no man's absence or presence could ever again threaten to take from her. Whatever title she carried, Duchess or otherwise, she understood, with a certainty that had only deepened with each passing year, that her true legacy lay not in the name she bore, but in the estate she had rebuilt, the policies she had helped shape, and the countless tenant families whose lives had been transformed by her willingness to look closely at what others had simply chosen to ignore. The storm that had once marked her arrival at Kane Manor's gates had long since passed into memory, but its lesson remained with her always, a reminder that even the coldest, most unwelcoming beginning could be transformed, through patience and unwavering resolve, into something that endured far longer, and mattered far more, than any single night of abandonment ever could.